Today, we're going to be talking about preparing for the summer, so injury prevention for golf, tennis, walking, and hiking. And the reason why I chose this topic is because the weather is starting to get nicer, the courts, the hiking trails, and golf courses are finally starting to dry up. And what I've noticed in the clinic is that most patients don't necessarily think about how demanding some of our favorite activities can be. So, for example, if you're going hiking in the highlands with some friends, maybe sometime this summer, and you haven't been outside much and maybe all winter, then you might end up looking something like this. So I believe everyone has experienced these aches and pains at some point in our lives, and often these aches and pains, or even worse, injuries, occur when we jump back into an activity too quickly after being sedentary for a while. So my goal for this presentation is to leave you with a starting point to recognize the areas of your body that should be a focus for your summer activity, and to be able to give you an idea on how to start building your own injury prevention program before you jump into your summer sport. So in order to meet these goals, we're going to discuss how injuries occur, the training types that are needed to meet your injury prevention goals, and we'll also look at an overview of what your fitness program might look like and how to pick and choose what areas of the body you want to focus on based on your sport. And while I'm going to give examples about golf, tennis, and hiking, you can apply these general principles to any type of physical activity. As well, this presentation is geared towards the seasonal athlete and the prevention of injury, but any athlete looking to enhance their performance could also benefit from it. So to get the most of this presentation, I'm going to ask you to self-reflect on your typical physical activity regimens. I'm also going to challenge you to think about your body, your strength, and your weaknesses, and maybe start to think like a physio a little bit. So by the end of this presentation, I hope you have an injury prevention goal, and for the summer to possibly be able to start addressing it on your own. So we do have poll questions throughout the presentation. So this first poll question.
Can you see the results there, Madison?
No, I can't actually.
Oh, okay. That's weird. I will tell you. Hiking, walking for everybody, and then golfing, tennis, and other. So
okay.
Everybody has walking, and then a few other things going on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'll have to get you to narrate through the polls. Okay, so since everybody has every sport, that's wonderful. So let's first talk about how injuries occur. So let's ignore all the freak accidents, the clumsy trips and falls that we cannot control, and focus on what we can influence. And in the physio world, these are called modifiable risk factors. So understanding modifiable risk factors and which ones are most prevalent in your life will help you understand the type of habits that put you at a higher risk of injury. So for example, the first one is deconditioning. So a decrease in flexibility, strength, or joint stability, which we'll get into in a bit what each one of those mean, but they can all put you at a higher risk of injury. So think of it like your physical fitness. Also, excessive or intermittent play can put you at a higher risk of injury. So excessive play would be, every day, maybe not giving your body enough rest. Intermittent play would be maybe more what we're tailoring this presentation towards. And it's perhaps you don't do much physical activity and then you decide to enter into a tennis tournament. And finally, it could also be poor technique. So like the gentleman swinging the golf club here, if you're constantly hitting the ground, maybe it's when you're walking, you're really heavy on your feet, or you're swinging the racket wrong in golf, any one of those can put you at a higher risk of injury. So the other example I have there is instability of joints. So if you're not able to have the wrist strength to hold the tennis racket properly when you swing, that could also put increased stress on the joints, which could cause an injury. So thinking back on your typical habits, do any of these risk factors apply to you? It could be many, it could be just a few, but we're going to focus mostly on the deconditioning. So before we dive into the details, I just want to mention it's still important to have a warm up. It's still important to have a cool down, as well as proper technique during your sport. And before you start any rigorous new physical activity, you should always consult a medical professional to get their advice and make sure that there's no contraindications, which means if there's no serious risk to your health by increasing your heart rate or starting to get your muscles to move more. Sorry, my slide is frozen there. There we go. So we have an idea how injuries occur. So now let's talk about how to prevent them. So there's four important elements I believe that you should have in an injury prevention program. So the first one is time. You need to have at least 4 weeks, but possibly up to 12 or more. And that's depending on your goal, your baseline level of health, your medical history, your history with the sport. And that's because we want to have meaningful change in your muscles. If you do a program a week before you go on a big golfing trip, it's not going to really make much of a difference. Another thing you need to have is consistency. So it has to be on a daily or at least weekly basis that you're addressing your muscles. Your muscles need slow change over time. So you need to give them enough opportunities to get stronger. You also need focus. So your exercises should target the area of the body that you're going to use. So for example, hiking, unless you're carrying like a really heavy backpack, you're probably going to mostly focus on the lower body. And finally, progress. So your exercises should not stay the same for the course of your 4 to 12 weeks. They need to get harder and more intense, and to the point where they meet the demands of the activity you're trying to prepare for. And as I mentioned before, your injury prevention program is going to be individual based to your needs. So every person's program is going to be a little bit different. So things like your individual goals. So if you're training to walk around the block, or if you're training for the summer to go hike a mountain, that's going to look very different on where you start. Your level of expertise in the sport. So have you been playing tennis since you were a kid, or did you pick up tennis last week? As well as, if you have any history of injuries or comorbidities, your baseline level activity, as well as your age. So this is an example of a 6-week program. So remember, your own program can vary in the number of weeks, but overall there should be this gradual increase in intensity and time until it reaches your outdoor activity and goal. As well, you can work on any of these training types at any point in your program, but your focus should be to gradually shift over time towards the sport that you intend to go back to, your activity you intend to go back to. So for example, you can work on strength in week 1 and week 2, but your focus should be stability and flexibility. And then when you get to week 3 and week 4, that's when strength, endurance, and muscle power come into play. And then finally 5 and 6, you're starting to go back to your sport. So let's look more specifically at what each of these training types actually mean. So some of you guys might already know some of this. So flexibility is the ability of a joint or series of joints to move through an unrestricted pain-free range of motion. So this would be mobility exercises and stretches. Arching your back, say over the end of a chair, or touching your toes, are all ways of not necessarily increasing your strength of your muscles, but they're working on increasing the ability of different parts of your body to move and bend the way they should be able to. So I included some parameters here if you're trying to implement it on your own. And with stretching or flexibility, you're looking at, 3 to 5 times you'll do a stretch, and you're going to hold for at least 30 seconds. But now research is saying you want to hold even longer. So, 2 to 3 minutes. And that's because you want to give your muscles enough time to kind of adapt to the stress you're putting on them when you're, holding a hamstring stretch like these folks in this picture here. So the next one is stability. So stability exercises can vary depending on the body part. However, most stability exercises are focused on stabilizing the core and while moving a limb in space. So for instance, if you're swinging a tennis racket, you must be able to hold your upright posture while you swing the racket. And this is the same thing for like a golf swing. And having a strong core and stability muscles are important when you increase the intensity of your exercise program. Without a strong foundation, your bigger muscles that are meant for carrying objects and kind of making gross movements will get tired and they'll cramp as they're trying to compensate for those little tiny stabilizer muscles that are typically on all the time. It's like asking like a sprinter to run a marathon. They're not going to be very good at it, and you'll get very tired and crampy very quickly. So the parameters again here. So with stability, because you want the muscles to be on all the time, it's going to be a little bit of a lighter intensity, or I put in here less than 60% of your 1 RM. So 1 RM is the gold standard measurement for people in the fitness world to kind of gauge how intense an exercise is going to be. So 1 rep max is what 1 RM means. It's not that important for the point of the presentation, but I thought it was kind of to include it for completeness. And so that would be, if you lifted up 1 thing with your biceps, one curl with your biceps, and that was the most you can do in one go at it, you would do less than 60% of that weight. Or often with stability, you're going to use your body weight. Your reps and your sets are going to be a little bit higher because you're asking your muscles to do more over time, and you're going to hold for a longer time. So for example, in this bird dog picture here, this lady has to stabilize her back and her hips, and now she's trying to move her arms without shifting her back and her hips. So the second part is week 3 and week 4. So we're looking at strength, endurance, and power. So after a few weeks of building a strong foundation and improving your range of motion, it's now time to shift your focus and start adding stress to the muscles. Increasing load to the muscles will start to bridge the gap between you being sedentary and you starting your outdoor activities. So strength, this is what you typically think of when you're doing a workout or when somebody says, let's go do some exercises. It's the ability to exert a force and overcome a resistance. That's picking up a box, that's moving something. And this intensity is a little bit higher. It's at moderate, so 60 to 80% of your 1 RM, whereas stability was less than 60. And your sets are typically 3 sets and 8 to 12 reps. So, when you go to physio and they say 3 sets of 10, that's where we get this number from. It's kind of the sweet spot for strengthening. And your rest is also going to be a little bit higher because you want to give your muscles time to regenerate before you lift again. So with stability, it's a lighter contraction, so you need less rest. With strength, it's a bit longer because the intensity is a bit higher. And I threw aerobic exercise in. So aerobic exercise is repetitive structured physical activity that requires the body's metabolic system to use oxygen to produce energy. And the reason why I chose to add this in is because our target summer activities all have a cardio component. We need to be able to walk or run, to play tennis, golf, and go hiking. And to keep things simple, we're just going to go based off the Canada's guidelines as our reference point. So Canada says you need to have moderate to vigorous aerobic physical activity so that you have at least 150 minutes of it a week. So moderate activity means you can still talk and while you walk or run, but you're starting to feel a little bit tired, you get a little bit sweaty. The 150 minutes can be broken down into smaller bouts. You're not expected to do 150 minutes all at once, and they can be as little as 10 minutes. So whatever works for your schedule. And this should be a goal. Work yourself up to having 150 minutes, a week. You shouldn't be trying to do 150 minutes a week if you haven't done any aerobic activity in a long time. I've also included power. So power is not something everybody's going to need. It's more of a performance piece, but I thought it was good to include it for the completeness again. And basically power is a lighter intensity, but you're asking the muscles to work quickly and as fast as they can. So for instance, this gentleman's throwing the ball against a wall as hard and as fast as he can. So the reps and sets are going to be kind of similar to strength, and you're going to still want a long rest because those muscles will get fatigued very quickly. So I'm not going to go through all this. This is just what we just talked about. It's just a lovely little summary table that I made. And if you are trying to build your own program at home, this is a great thing to screenshot, or you can email me and ask for it. But it's a good reference point to kind of picking and deciding what exercise type or exercise goal that you want to focus on. So the last part of the program, that week 5 and week 6, is sport integration. So sport integration is, at the end of your 6 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever it might be, you're ready to start kind of practicing your sport. Often this means using the equipment. So, if you're going for a hike and you're planning on bringing a big backpack, maybe you start walking around the block with a heavy backpack on. And you don't go as far or as long as you typically would, or your goal is, but you start to introduce those types of stresses to your body. And as well, that's the same thing with the decreased intensity. So maybe you go out and you play a light game of tennis and warm up, or you start to go to the driving range for golf. But the important thing is to allow yourself rest days in between. You'll be surprised how many people say they feel amazing at the gym, they did so well, and then they come to me the next day and they're like, oh my goodness, I went way too hard the day before. So give your body time to adapt. So I'm going to take a pause here. It's a good time to stop, take a breath. Does anybody have any questions so far? We're going to get into next the type of exercises and the sport-specific considerations that you should have for your different sports. So now we kind of know all the different components of what you should have in your injury prevention program, but let's get into the details specifically for each sport. So we're going to look at walking and hiking, we're going to look at golf, and then we're going to finish with some tennis. So first, walking and hiking. So this is the part where you guys get a little bit more involved. So throughout these examples, I'm going to get you to ask yourself, what areas of the bodies do I need to use for my sport? What type of training should I focus on for each area of the body? So flexibility, power, strength, stability, and what exercises will I choose to meet my goal? So first, let's go through question 1. I hope you guys can see the lovely lady here taking a walk. So what areas of the body do I need to use for hiking? So taking a look at this lady's gait, so the way she's walking, ask yourself, what areas do you think are important? So try to pick 2 or 3 areas that stand out to you. And Kate, if you don't mind pulling up the second poll question there.
So the question says, what body parts do I need to use for hiking? And the options are neck, shoulders, arms, back, hips, knees, ankles. So everybody can go ahead and answer what they think. And so do you have to pick one, Madison, or can you pick more than one?
You can pick more than one. So I would
cool.
say probably try to pick 2 or 3 that you think. So I have 2 and 3 in mind in my head that we'll go through in a second. So try to pick what you think I'll say.
Okay, we've got 50% done. So far we have 1 for arms, 3 for arms, 4 for back, 4 for hips, 4 for knees, 4 for ankles, and 1 for shoulders.
So you're not wrong. So it is, you can basically justify any part of the body, especially if somebody is wearing a backpack, that upper body stuff is going to come into play. But for the purpose of this presentation, I kind of narrowed it down to the lower body. So the hips, the knees, the ankle, and the feet. But people who said arms, absolutely, you're right, because you do swing your arms and you're carrying things often if you're not just planning to walk around the block. So for this example, let's focus on, probably only seeing some circles right now. Let's focus on the hips and the knees. So I specifically chose both the hips and the knees because they're very interconnected. So in the following examples, you're going to notice that some of the exercises directly relate to the hip and some to the knee. But the biggest complaint that I hear about in the clinic about walking and hiking is typically knee pain. But more often than not, it really has to do with hip strength. So your hip adductor muscles, so that's the muscles, if you see here on the picture on the left, on the outside of your hip, your glute area, those muscles help keep your knee in a proper alignment. And this can significantly reduce the risk of knee pain if those muscles are strong. But often they're forgotten about or ignored when you're doing an exercise program for your knee. So I have a second question here for you. So what type of training should I focus on for the hips and knee? So if we're only looking at the hips and knees and thinking way back to the definitions at the beginning of the presentation, what would you want to focus on? So for the purpose of this presentation, I would say pick 2. And like I said before, there's really no wrong answer. You could justify any one of these, but maybe pick 2 that would be more tailored towards injury prevention. So Kate, if you don't mind pulling up the next poll question there.
All right, it's up on the screen. It says, what type of training should I focus on for the hips and the knees? Somebody's like me, they click on it right away. Other people are like thinking about it for a second.
This is a trickier question than the last one. The last one's a gimme, but it's going to get a little harder now.
Oh, I think, let's see, it says strength. I think we have stability down twice. So it says strength, stability, flexibility, and power. And
okay, they're all there. You can pick either stability.
That's right. Well, in that case, then we have, 3 people that agree stability, 3 that think flexibility. No votes yet for strength or power. Give them 2 more seconds. No, we got another vote. So 4 for stability and 4 for flexibility. There we go. And the poll, share the results.
Okay, cool. So I actually chose stability and strength, but again, flexibility is not a wrong answer. But the reason why I mostly chose maybe stability and strength over flexibility is because you're not using a massive range of motion when you're walking or hiking. You're kind of within that, that middle range of how your hip could swing back and forth, and same with your knee. But if you have very restricted flexibility of your knee or hip, absolutely, that definitely can come into a play and also possibly could cause injury. So let's get into a little bit more detail about those. So the reason why I chose strength is because you need to be able to lift your legs over and over again while you move over various terrains, so hills or rocks. And it's important to have enough strength in the muscles, such as your quadricep, which is your thigh muscle, so you don't overexert them. So this can result in inflammation of the tendon, or worse, possibly a possible tear if you can't keep up with the demands of your hike. Then the other one is stability. So I chose stability because as you walk, you need to be able to control the position of your knee and hip, kind of what we talked about before. And you want to be able to keep that proper alignment, from the first kilometer you walk to the 10th kilometer, or whatever your distance may be. So if you don't have that muscle endurance to be able to maintain the proper hip and knee alignment, this can cause uneven pressures on the joints and possibly result in some of those aches and pains and overuse and injury over time. So question 3, what exercises will I choose to meet my goal? So I'm giving you the answer for this one. So for your hips and knees, for strength and stability, it might look something like this. So at the top here, you can see this is our program. So week 1 and week 2, maybe you're working on stability at the knee. So this is a fairly advanced exercise. And there's time in between here, you're progressing this exercise, and eventually you're going out for a hike. In the bottom here, you can see that it's strength. So, maybe you start with just stepping up on a stair and stepping back down, be the first step or sidewalk, and you're just working on getting that quad a little bit stronger. But in the hopes of when you go for a walk, maybe, this is Victoria Park and Truro, all those stairs, you're progressing it to be, sports specific. So it's also, I just want to remind you, it's important that you remember that this program is continuum. You can work on strength in the first few weeks. That's totally fine, as long as you understand that you need to progress slow and gradually and increase the intensity over time until it matches your goal. And so the next slide, if you maybe don't listen to me, or perhaps, you trip, you fall, and that's life, things happen. So what are the injuries that are most common with hiking and walking? So specifically, what we've already talked about a bit with the knee is that patellar tendinopathy. So tendinopathy, means dysfunction of the tendon. So if you're thinking about your big thigh muscle, your quad muscle, and just under your kneecap, there's a little tendon there. And if that quad muscle isn't strong enough or isn't able to adapt to the loads that's being put under when you're walking, that tendon can get irritated and inflamed over time. So often this happens with hikers and walkers, or often with kids as well, with playing basketball and sports where they're jumping a lot. Patellofemoral pain syndrome for the knee is that alignment issue. So if you're most often women, if their hips are wide and their knees kind of cave in, what can happen is you can have uneven stress on the knee itself. So when you're walking, that kneecap isn't gliding as smoothly as it should, and over time that can cause inflammation and pain and tenderness. With the upper leg, the hamstring strains, so we talked a lot about the quad, and this is where your flexibility answer comes into play. So the hamstring, if that muscle is too tight, over time, what can happen is that muscle can, when you go to use it, maybe step up really quickly on a rock, or you walk down a hill too fast, that muscle can kind of pull and have tiny, tiny little tears in it, which we call like a strain. And then it's sore and it's hard to use and you can't walk as well. And it will get better over time, but that's often a common one for hikers and walkers. And the last one I added, we didn't talk much about the ankle, but is a common one, is Achilles tendinopathy. So most people maybe know it as Achilles tendinitis. And what that is, if you see in this picture here, it's a little kind of, that's a bad Achilles tendon tear, but often it's just like a little bit of micro tears or inflammation at the bottom of your heel. And that's often because your calf muscle is way too tight, or there's unequal or imbalancing stresses going through the bottom of your heel. Okay, so next one is golf. So we're going to go through the same kind of process again, just to see if we're starting to get the hang of it. So the next slide is those same questions again. So what areas of the bodies do I need to use for my sport? What type of training should I focus on for each area of the body? And what exercises will I choose to meet my goals? So now this is a little bit more complicated than walking. So what body parts do I need to use for this golf swing? So what I would do is, as a physio, we would look at this and we go, okay, so we're looking at a swing. Let's look from maybe head to toe or, bottom up and pick, what are some of the major joints or muscles that are being used. So if Kate, you don't mind pulling up the next poll question, please.
Okay, the poll is launched. It says, what body parts do I need to use for a golf swing? The options are neck, shoulders, elbows and wrists, back, hips, knees.
And there's multiple answers and there's no wrong answer per se.
We've got almost everybody. So we've got 3 votes so far for shoulders, 2 for elbows and wrists, 4 for back, 4 for hips, 1 for knees.
Nice, very good. So I had very similar answers. So I chose upper back, shoulders, elbows, and wrist. And like I said before, you could have picked any part, but these ones tend to be the ones that golfers get most injured. And what I thought of, just like a little bit of a background information. So typically amateur golfers have injuries that are caused by swing patterns developed around their physical limitations. So what that means is, if you don't have this crazy amount of shoulder rotation that this lady in the video has, you're going to find other ways to get there. And it might not be using the body parts that are developed or created to kind of rotate or swing that much. So what happens is you end up having extra stress over certain areas of the bodies, and that leads to injuries. So, and this changes, and I know I would be shocked if we had a professional golfer here, but that changes from professional to amateur golfers. And professional golfers, we primarily see injuries in the wrist, back, hips, and shoulders, but that's more from overuse. And in amateurs, we tend to see injuries in the back and elbows due to poor technique and those dysfunctional movement patterns that I just talked about. Okay, so now thinking about, I have upper back bolded here for a reason. We're just going to think about the upper back. What type of training should you focus on for the upper back? So you ask yourself, if I was doing an exercise program and we're looking at this lady's swing up here and you can see her upper back moves quite a bit, thinking about strength, stability, power, flexibility, what maybe pick 2 would you say are the most important? And Kate, if you don't mind pulling up the next question.
It's on there. So what type of training should I focus on for the upper back? We've got the strength, stability, flexibility, power. Somebody's jumped in there and they know that flexibility and power are definitely part of it. A vote for strength. Another 2 votes for flexibility. So far we have 2 for strength, 3 for flexibility, and 2 for power. Okay,
very good. So what I chose was stability and flexibility. So absolutely power, especially if you're a regular golfer and you're trying to get your swing farther and farther, that drive farther and farther. Strength also plays an important component into that kind of power component. But for injury prevention, I chose to focus on stability and flexibility. So as you can see in the upper back of the golfer, she needs to significantly rotate through that backswing and the follow through. And without the flexibility, the upper back would be under increased stress and tension and would cause other areas, like we talked about before, to try to compensate. So, and I chose stability because stability and flexibility often go hand in hand. If you move more and you need to be able to control that movement. So if not, that can lead to stress and uneven forces on the joints, but the joints are then at the mercy of your technique, which with golfing specifically, everybody's technique's a little different, and the bigger muscles during your golf swing. So typically, if you're making something move more, if you're stretching it out, or more so the joints, so you're practicing maybe rotating that back or arching that back more, you always want to follow it up with a little bit of muscle strengthening so that as those joints move more, as you dust off the rust, there's something there, there's muscles there to help control that movement. That's a very important one. And what exercises will I choose to meet my goal? I have the answers here already. So if you're thinking about stability and flexibility, maybe your program looks something like this. So here's our program at the top again. So the first line is flexibility. So that's what we just talked about. If we're working on the upper back and getting the joints to move more, you might start at just, arching your back over a chair. And, all of us typically sit at a desk all day or sit on our phones or iPads or whatever else we use. And we don't get into those extended postures. So even starting as simple as a chair, dusting off the rust, getting the joints moving, and slowly progressing that over time. So you'll have things in between this chair exercise, and then finally out to the driving range, arching, twisting the back, and so that you have kind of a pain-free range of motion in that upper back. Pardon me. So the other one is stability. So if we are asking the joints to move more, the bird dog is on, well, every physio or every chiro or our healthcare professional probably knows this exercise. And basically it's asking your hips and your back muscles to not move while you move your arm and your leg. So you can see why that'd be important specifically in golf, because you're holding your core still, you're holding your hip still as you swing through the golf club. And finally, also, and not including just your upper back, but that stability will eventually transfer into you kind of carrying your golf clubs around the 18 holes. So what type of injuries are most common in golf? So I picked shoulder, elbow, and lower back. There's so many, but shoulder, so rotator cuff tendinopathies or rotator cuff injuries is often something you hear about, but you never really know what that is. And those are muscles that sit on the back of the shoulder and that come to the front. And they're those little stabilizer muscles. So when you think about, how to train those muscles, they're going to be the ones that are a lower intensity and more frequent use. And the idea with the rotator cuff, what happens is if those little stabilizer muscles are not strong enough to take the forces of maybe you constantly swinging the golf club, then they can get inflamed and injured. Golfer's elbow, it's appropriately named because what happens is on the inside of your elbow, so that's where your pinky is, kind of on the inside, there can be too much stress or load on those muscles if you're gripping quite a bit. So golfers who tend to have like a tighter grip, or they just use their wrist flexors muscles a lot. So maybe they love to golf and they're also a carpenter. What can happen over time as the muscles at the inside of the elbow that control your grip can get sore, inflamed, and tired. So the solution to that is, slowly progressing the strength over time before you get to that point, or giving it a rest and then slowly progressing so it doesn't come back. The last thing, lower back. So lower back is also a common one as well. And it's the same for the upper back, is you can get these like facet sprain strains. So what that means is, you go for that extra long drive at the beginning of the hole and something in your back tweaks. And that could be a little bit of a joint that moved, a bit too much or got stuck a little bit. And what happens there is the muscles around kind of get really tight and can get spasm and sore. Okay, so we're at our final sport, tennis. So what areas of the body do I need to use for tennis? So Kate, if you don't mind bringing up the next poll question.
There actually isn't another one visible. I think we may have maxed out our polls.
Oh, okay. Well, then this one's an easy
march
one either way. It might have got lost. But what area of the bodies do I need to use for tennis? So that's a funny one because really there was going to be absolutely no wrong answer. When you think about it, tennis uses every part of the body. And on top of that, it also uses your cardio, right? Your aerobic capacity that we talked about before. So let's dive into a little bit deeper of the cardio section since we've talked pretty extensively about muscles. That's just another picture there of a lady hitting a swing, and you can see she's sprinting to it, then she's stabilizing for it, then she's swinging the racket. So what type of training should I focus on for improving my cardio in tennis? So we already know it's going to be aerobic. It's kind of another gimme question. So with aerobic activity, you're thinking about running, biking, walking. But as we talked before, you need to start slow with cardio and build up. Just because the Canada guidelines say you need 150 minutes a week does not mean you should start at 150 minutes a week if you haven't been there in a long time. So thinking about that, what exercises will we choose to meet those goals? So when it comes to cardio, I hope this picture kind of demonstrates, the slow progression. Because when you specifically train your body for a sport like tennis, it's important to consider how your body's going to move during a match. So a tennis player typically does short sprints with frequent rest in between points. And actually, just a fun little fact, the average amateur tennis player actually travels 3 to 4 kilometers during the course of a game. So when you're selecting your exercises or the type of aerobic activity that you want to do, this needs to be considered. So for instance, if you're only doing biking and really slow long distance running, that's not going to necessarily prepare you well for a game of tennis. Whereas if you did some short sprints or maybe some uphill running or training or interval training, that would be more suited towards that sport integration idea where you're trying to match the demands of your sport. So specifically, when building up your aerobic capacity, like for a sport like tennis, you want to focus on getting your heart rate up for a very short amount of time and then practice resting so your heart rate coming down again. So you might have heard of something called like HIIT workouts. They're pretty popular now. So HIIT workouts are about working hard for a short amount of time and then resting for a short amount of time before repeating that cycle over and over again. And again, this is a spectrum. So, HIIT stuff sounds very intense and scary, but really it can start as walking on the treadmill at a slow speed and then walking on the treadmill at a little bit faster speed, slowing down and repeating that again. But specifically with aerobic exercise, you want to make sure if you're doing something like HIIT, you talk to a medical professional before you jump into it, because there is increased stress on the heart and the muscles that could be an issue if you have medical history. So the last kind of slide here before we finish up is what type of injuries are common in tennis. So shoulder rotator cuff injuries, similar to golf, right? You still have to stabilize that shoulder through your tennis swing. The other one is tennis elbow. So it is the opposite of golfer's elbow. So instead of on the inside where your pinky is, it's on the outside of your elbow. And the reason why is you're using more of those extensor muscles or that kind of wrist kind of going back motion when you're swinging the tennis racket. So often it's the same exact injury mechanism. It's just the muscles on the outside of the elbow can't take the forces being put on them. So if you jumped into tennis after not doing any sort of physical activity for a while, you're going to notice your forearm is going to get really sore. But hopefully it doesn't actually get injured. But if it does, that can lead to some inflammation, irritation, worst case scenario, possibly a tear. That doesn't happen too often though, over the outside of that elbow. And the last thing I threw in here is lower leg. So similar to the other things, especially when we talked about hiking, you can still have patellar tendinopathies. That quad you need, or that thigh muscle you need to explode across the court. And often what happens is if that quad is not ready and over time you're constantly like sprinting left, sprinting right, that tendon at the bottom of your kneecap can get tired and get inflamed, and hamstring strains as well. If you're extending your leg very quickly or sprinting away, what can happen if that muscle doesn't have enough flexibility? It can kind of tear a little bit, or it can be stressed a little bit, which can cause inflammation, pain, and a longer recovery time. So my final message, I hope you guys are still with me after all that. So my final message is that deconditioning puts you at a higher risk of injury. So, I want you to recognize that it's more than just swinging the golf club. You have to think about what your body needs for the physical activity that you want to jump back into. So you got to think about the body parts involved. You got to think about the training types, and you need to be very sport specific. Every single training's program is going to be different, but as long as you listen to your body and take your time and allow those muscles to adapt, you should be okay. And finally, to have a successful injury program, like we talked about, lots of time. It can't be week before you start. You need to be consistent with it. It needs to be sport specific, like I just mentioned. And if one thing I can send you home with, it needs to be a slow progression. And that is all I have for you guys today. Is there any questions? And you can also feel free to, if you have questions or you want a copy of the presentation or anything at all, of course, you can reach out to me. And if you found this overwhelming and aren't sure where to start, but really want to implement your program, of course, you can stop into a physio or chiro, even if you don't have an injury, and they can at least get you started into some sort of program for the summer.